The black ribbon of highway stretched ahead like an endless abyss, its jagged edges illuminated only by the pale glow of Emily's headlights. The clock on the dashboard read 2:13 a.m. She shouldn't have been on the road this late, but the isolated countryside was the only shortcut back to her hometown. Her best friend's wedding was tomorrow, and she couldn't bear the thought of missing it. The promise of laughter, love, and familiar faces gave her courage to venture down this desolate path. The first hour passed uneventfully, but then the fog rolled in. It wasn't the gentle, misty kind that kissed the treetops. This fog was dense and aggressive, curling like living tendrils around her car. The beams of her headlights barely penetrated it, creating an otherworldly cocoon. As the world disappeared into swirling gray, Emily gripped the wheel tighter, her pulse quickening. She turned on the radio, hoping for some company, but static was all she found. Every station was a crackling void. With a nervous laugh, she switched it off. Silence was better than that strange, dissonant buzz. The hum of her tires became a steady rhythm, almost hypnotic. She forced herself to focus on the thin strip of road she could still see. A shadow darted across the beams of her headlights. Her heart leaped into her throat as she slammed on the brakes, tires screeching against the asphalt. The car shuddered to a halt, and for a moment there was only her ragged breathing. There was nothing in the road. Emily scanned the fog, her eyes straining for any movement. A deer? A coyote? Maybe her overworked mind was playing tricks on her. She laughed nervously, brushing her hair out of her eyes. "Get it together, Em," she muttered and started driving again. The road seemed endless. Her GPS had gone silent, the screen frozen on a blank map. Her phone, plugged into the charger, refused to pick up a signal. The familiar hum of the tires now felt oppressive, like a drumbeat echoing through a cavern. A sensation crept into her chest, something primal, a whisper in the back of her mind that told her she wasn't alone. A shape loomed ahead, tall and dark. As she got closer, it resolved into a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. Emily's stomach clenched. A hitchhiker? Out here? The figure turned its head, and though her car barely slowed, she could have sworn she saw its face, or lack of one. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin. Her blood turned to ice as she sped past. In her rearview mirror, the figure stood motionless, fading back into the fog as though it had never been there. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to lose meaning. The fog thickened, and the road began to change. The smooth asphalt gave way to cracks, then to gravel, and finally to dirt. Emily frowned. She hadn't seen a single turnoff. She should still be on the main highway, shouldn't she? A flicker of movement drew her eyes to the side mirror. Something was following her. At first, it was just a blur in the fog, but as she glanced again, she realized it wasn't a something. It was a someone. A person was sprinting behind her car, their limbs moving unnaturally fast, their face obscured by the haze. Panic clawed at her throat as she pressed the accelerator. The engine roared, but the figure didn't fall behind. In fact, it was gaining on her, its grotesque movements growing clearer as it drew nearer. Its head lolled unnaturally, its arms flailing as though they were broken. The car hit a bump, and Emily nearly lost control. Her heart thundered in her chest as she wrestled with the wheel, narrowly avoiding a tree that seemed to appear out of nowhere. When she looked in the mirror again, the figure was gone. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. Ahead, the road forked, a choice she didn't remember from her GPS. The left path was lined with dead trees, their gnarled branches clawing at the fog. The right looked marginally better, a dirt track with faint tire marks suggesting recent use. She veered right. Her tires crunched over the gravel and the fog began to lift. For the first time in what felt like hours, she could see the trees, the stars, even the outline of a farmhouse in the distance. Hope flickered in her chest. Maybe she could stop there, get directions. Maybe. A figure stepped into the middle of the road. Emily screamed as she swerved, the car careening off the path and into the ditch. Her head slammed into the steering wheel, and the world spun. Pain bloomed at her temple, but she was alive. The same couldn't be said for her car. Steam hissed from under the crumpled hood. She reached for her phone, praying for a signal, but her hand froze. A face peered in through the driver's side window. It was the same faceless figure from before, its smooth, blank skin pressed against the glass as if it were trying to see her. She scrambled for the lock button, but it was too late. The door creaked open. Emily bolted from the car, her legs burning as she sprinted toward the farmhouse. The figure followed, its movements grotesque and jerky. The fog was thinning, but that only made her pursuer more visible. Its faceless head turned toward her, and though it had no eyes, she could feel its gaze. The farmhouse door was unlocked. She slammed it behind her, throwing the deadbolt before collapsing against it. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. The house was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that felt alive. She took a tentative step forward, her shoes creaking on the wooden floor. "Hello?" Her voice was barely a whisper. No answer. Something scuttled across the ceiling. She froze, her eyes darting upward. A shadow shifted in the corner of the room, long and spindly. It wasn't the figure from the road. This was something worse. Emily screamed as it lunged. The sky was moonless, the darkness outside swallowing even the faintest glimmers of light. Max tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale as he navigated the twisting mountain road. It was nearly midnight, and the dense forest that lined both sides of the road seemed alive, its skeletal branches clawing at the car with every gust of wind. He shouldn't have been out here. It was the kind of warning locals would mutter in the corner of a bar. Stay off Ridgeback Road after dark. Something about accidents, disappearances, strange happenings. But Max had been running late. He was on a deadline, and this route shaved an hour off his journey. The radio hissed, crackling faintly before switching off entirely. "Great," Max muttered, smacking the console. His phone wasn't any better, a lonely no signal mocking him from the screen. He glanced at it, hoping for a miracle, and when he looked back at the road, there it was. A figure stood dead center in his lane. Max swerved, the tires screeching as he veered onto the shoulder. The car shuddered, and for a moment it felt like it would tip over. His heart thundered in his chest as he yanked the wheel back to straighten out. The car came to a halt, the engine idling like an impatient heartbeat. He turned his head toward the road. No one was there. His headlights swept the asphalt, revealing only the empty curve ahead. His stomach churned. He could have sworn he'd seen someone, a woman, maybe, her pale dress fluttering in the wind. Gripping the wheel, he laughed nervously. "Just your imagination," he said out loud, as if the sound of his voice could ground him in reality. But as he reached for the gear shift, something moved in his peripheral vision. It was a reflection in the rearview mirror. Max froze. There in the back seat was a figure, a woman, her hair hanging in damp, tangled clumps over her face. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like her neck had been broken. She wasn't moving, but he felt her gaze, heavy, suffocating. Before Max could react, the car's interior lights flickered. The air grew colder, and the smell of damp earth filled his nostrils. His breath came out in white puffs. Then the woman moved. She didn't lunge or scream. She simply tilted her head further until it was nearly upside down, her hair falling away to reveal a face that wasn't human at all. The eyes were black pits, and her mouth, if it could be called that, stretched impossibly wide, jagged teeth glistening like broken glass. Max screamed, throwing the door open and stumbling out into the freezing night. The forest loomed around him, every shadow a threat. He turned back to the car. It sat there, still idling, but the woman was gone. He didn't dare get back inside. Instead, he began walking, his footsteps crunching on the gravel shoulder. The road seemed endless, each bend leading to another identical stretch of darkness. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No insects, no rustling leaves, just the sound of his own breathing. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, like wind through the trees, but it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. A voice, raspy, broken, was calling his name. Max. He spun around, but the road behind him was empty. His pulse thundered in his ears as he turned back, quickening his pace. The voice followed him, repeating his name in an eerie sing-song. "Max, come back." Ahead, the road widened into a clearing, and for a moment he thought he saw lights, headlights, another car. Relief surged through him as he broke into a run. But as he neared the lights, his stomach dropped. They weren't headlights. Two glowing orbs hovered in the middle of the clearing, too high to be on any car, too bright to be natural. And beneath them was a shape, a hunched, grotesque silhouette that shifted and writhed as though its skin didn't quite fit. It turned toward him, and those lights, those eyes, pierced through the darkness. Max stumbled backward, but the thing lunged, its movements impossibly fast. It didn't walk or run. It seemed to flow across the ground like liquid shadow. Max bolted, his feet slipping on the gravel as he darted back toward the forest. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Branches tore at his face and arms as he plunged into the trees, his breaths ragged. The world around him seemed to close in, the trees growing denser, the darkness thicker. He tripped and fell, his knees slamming into the cold, hard earth. Behind him, the whispers returned, louder now, closer. Max, you can't leave. He scrambled to his feet, but as he did, something grabbed his ankle. A hand, cold, skeletal, its grip unrelenting. He kicked and thrashed, but it dragged him down, pulling him into the dirt. He clawed at the ground, his nails breaking as he tried to hold on. The last thing Max saw before the darkness swallowed him was the woman's face. She smiled, her jagged teeth glinting in the faint light, and whispered one final word, "Stay." The storm had come out of nowhere. One moment, Jenna's drive home from her sister's house was peaceful, her car slicing through the stillness of the backcountry road. The next, lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in sharp, eerie flashes. Rain hammered against her windshield, the wipers barely keeping up, and the wind howled like some primal beast. The road was treacherous, narrow, and bordered by thick woods. Her GPS, unreliable in this remote area, kept recalculating, the blue arrow spinning aimlessly on the screen. She cursed under her breath, gripping the wheel tightly. The nearest town wasn't far, maybe 20 minutes if she could just stay on course. Her headlights caught movement up ahead. At first, she thought it was a deer, but as she slowed, she realized it was a person. A man stood at the edge of the road, his face obscured by a hood. He was drenched, water pouring off his clothes in rivulets. Jenna's heart thudded. What was he doing out here in this weather? Against her better judgment, she eased her car to a stop and rolled down the passenger window just enough to be heard. "Do you need help?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The man didn't answer. He didn't move. Lightning flashed again, and she caught a glimpse of his face, or lack thereof. His features were blank, as though erased by some cruel hand. Jenna gasped, her foot slamming the gas pedal before she even realized it. Her car fishtailed as it sped away, her breathing ragged. The rain intensified, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning as if mocking her panic. She glanced in her rearview mirror. The man was gone. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. A sudden thunk came from above, like something heavy had landed on the roof of her car. Her stomach turned to ice. She forced herself to keep driving, her mind racing. Maybe it was a branch, she thought. Maybe the wind had knocked something loose. But then it moved. She could hear it, a slow, deliberate scraping sound that sent shivers down her spine. She resisted the urge to stop. Stopping would mean facing whatever was up there, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Instead, she pressed harder on the gas, her car barreling through the storm. The scraping turned to pounding, like fists slamming against the metal. "Go away," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please go away." Ahead, a sign loomed out of the rain, its letters barely visible. "Bridge out!" Jenna slammed on the brakes, the car skidding wildly before coming to a halt just inches from the jagged edge of the collapsed bridge. Her chest heaved as she stared into the abyss below, the river raging like a monster in the dark. And then she felt it. The weight on the roof shifted. Whatever was up there slid down, its form visible for just a moment in the headlights. It wasn't a man. It wasn't human. The thing crouched in front of her car, its limbs too long, its body bent at unnatural angles. Its face was a twisted amalgamation of features, eyes that didn't quite align, a mouth that stretched too wide, teeth like shards of bone. It smiled at her, a grotesque parody of joy, before it reached out and slammed its hands onto the hood. Jenna screamed. She threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning as she tried to escape. The creature held firm, its grip impossibly strong. The car lurched backward, dragging the thing with it, but its grin only widened. She hit the brakes, flinging the creature off balance, and then gunned the engine. The car shot forward, right toward the bridge's edge. At the last second, she turned sharply, skidding to a stop inches from the drop. When she looked up, the thing was gone. The rain eased, the storm retreating as suddenly as it had come. But Jenna didn't feel relief. She knew, somehow, it wasn't over. She turned the car around, driving slowly now, her eyes scanning the road. The night seemed quieter, too quiet, as though the world was holding its breath. When she reached the spot where she'd first seen the man, she stopped. There was no sign of him, no footprints in the muddy roadside, just emptiness. She thought she was alone, until she saw the handprints on her windshield. The sign for Oak Hollow Forest had come and gone, swallowed by the darkness behind Alex's car. His headlights struggled against the oppressive night, the trees lining the narrow road twisting into grotesque shapes under the pale beams. He checked the time on his phone, 1:37 a.m., and sighed. He had taken a wrong turn miles back, and the longer he drove, the more lost he felt. His phone had no signal, of course, and the map app refused to load. He debated stopping, but the road was too narrow and the forest too silent, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Besides, the thought of stepping out into that suffocating blackness made his skin crawl. As he rounded another bend, his headlights illuminated something ahead. A vehicle, abandoned on the side of the road. Its driver's door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Alex slowed down, his gut churning. He rolled down his window just enough to call out, "Hello, anyone there?" Silence. The car looked old, its paint chipped and faded. Weeds had begun to creep up around its tires, as if it had been there for weeks, maybe months. But the open door suggested otherwise. Alex debated whether to stop. His instincts screamed no, but curiosity gnawed at him. With a shaky hand, he pulled over, keeping his engine running. Grabbing a flashlight from the glove box, he stepped out. The night was colder than he expected, and the air carried a strange metallic tang. His flashlight flickered as he approached the car, its beam cutting through the dark like a knife. The driver's seat was empty, but the interior showed signs of a struggle. Papers strewn across the floor, the upholstery torn as if by claws. "Hello," he called again, his voice trembling. A faint sound answered him, a rustling from the trees. Alex froze, shining his flashlight toward the noise. The beam landed on something hanging from a low branch, an object that swung lazily in the wind. It was a shoe. Before he could process what he was seeing, a louder noise erupted behind him. A sharp, deliberate tap, tap, tap on the roof of his car. He spun around, the flashlight trembling in his hand. There was nothing on the roof, but the tapping continued, moving to the trunk, then the passenger side window. Heart pounding, Alex sprinted back to his car, yanking the door open and slamming it shut behind him. He locked the doors, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands. The tapping stopped. The silence was worse. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror. For a moment, he saw only the empty road behind him. But then something moved. A figure stepped out of the forest, its movements slow, deliberate. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs stretched too long for its body. Its face was wrong. The features were distorted, as if smeared by an unseen hand. Its mouth hung open, an endless void, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were hollow sockets, black and glistening. Alex slammed the car into drive, his tires spinning as he tore away from the scene. The figure didn't chase him, but as he glanced in the rearview mirror, it didn't shrink into the distance. It stood still, watching, its hollow eyes fixed on his car. The road stretched on, each mile blending into the next. The trees seemed to grow closer, their branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. His headlights flickered. Then, just ahead, he saw it, the same abandoned car. Alex's breath hitched. It was impossible. He hadn't turned, hadn't looped back. But there it was, identical in every detail, down to the open driver's door. His own skid marks from earlier were gone, as though they had never been there. "No," he whispered, gripping the wheel tighter. "No, no, no." The tapping started again, this time on the roof of his car. Alex didn't stop. He floored the gas, the engine roaring as he sped past the abandoned vehicle. The tapping grew louder, frantic, like dozens of fingers drumming against the metal. He didn't dare look up. The road began to change. The asphalt cracked and buckled, turning to dirt, then to something softer, wet and spongy like decayed leaves. His tires struggled for traction, and the headlights dimmed further, barely illuminating the path ahead. And then the forest opened up. The road ended abruptly at a clearing, the ground a patchwork of mud and gnarled roots. In the center stood a massive tree, its bark blackened and twisted. Hanging from its branches were objects, shoes, clothing, and worse. Human remains dangled like ornaments, their faces frozen in silent screams. Alex slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car skidded into the clearing, its engine sputtering before cutting out completely. Silence descended. He sat frozen, his breath shallow. The tapping returned, louder now, coming from all sides. Shadows moved around the car, circling, closing in. Then, from the darkness, a face appeared at his window. It was the figure from the road, its hollow eyes peering inside. This time it smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched impossibly far. Alex screamed as the windows shattered, the darkness flooding in like water. The gas station was the only sign of life for miles, its flickering neon sign a weak promise of respite in the vast desert night. Lydia pulled her car into the gravel lot, her headlights revealing a battered old pickup parked near one of the pumps. The building itself was small and dilapidated, a relic of an earlier era. The lone light above the entrance buzzed weakly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the cracked pavement. Her fuel gauge had been flirting with empty for the past 20 minutes, and the thought of breaking down out here was unbearable. She grabbed her wallet and stepped out, shivering as the cold desert air bit at her skin. The place felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. The pump screen blinked out of order in blocky green letters. Frustrated, she glanced toward the building. There was a dim glow inside, and a shadow moved past the smudged glass door. Someone was there. Relief flooded her as she made her way toward the entrance. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty store. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made her nose wrinkle. Rows of shelves stood half empty, stocked with outdated goods and dusty cans. Behind the counter sat an old man, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't greet her, didn't even look up. His hands moved methodically, polishing a rusted wrench that seemed far too large for him. "Hi," Lydia said hesitantly, approaching the counter. "The pump isn't working. Is there another one?" The man paused, his hands stilling. Slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes were milky white, unfocused, as though blind. And yet, she felt his gaze pierce through her. "Pump's dead," he said, his voice dry and cracked like the desert outside. "Ain't no gas here." She frowned, glancing at the register behind him. "But this is a gas station. There has to be something." The old man's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Used to be," he murmured. "Not anymore." A sudden thud from the back of the store made Lydia jump. She turned toward the noise, but the aisles were empty, shadows pooling like spilled ink between the shelves. "What was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man didn't answer. When she looked back at him, his expression had changed. The smile was gone, replaced by something darker. "You should leave," he said softly, "while you still can." Her heart pounded. She backed away toward the door, but as her hand touched the handle, she froze. Through the glass, she saw her car, but it wasn't empty. A figure sat in the driver's seat, motionless. "Hey!" she yelled, rushing outside. The cold air hit her like a slap as she approached the car. The figure didn't move. Her headlights illuminated it fully now. A man in a tattered suit, his head slumped forward. His skin was waxy and gray, like a mannequin left out in the sun. Her stomach turned as she edged closer. She knocked on the window, her voice shaking. "Are you okay?" The man's head snapped up. His face was a mask of grotesque features, his eyes black pits that seemed to swallow the light. His mouth opened wide, wider than it should have, a guttural growl emanating from the depths of his throat. Lydia screamed, stumbling backward. The car's engine roared to life, its headlights flaring impossibly bright, blinding her. She shielded her eyes, the sound of the growling engine reverberating in her ears. When the lights dimmed, the car was gone. She spun around, her breath hitching. The gas station was dark now, the neon sign extinguished. The old man was nowhere to be seen. The silence pressed down on her like a weight, broken only by the faint crunch of gravel behind her. She turned slowly. A crowd of figures stood in the lot, their shapes barely visible in the moonlight. Each one wore tattered clothes, their faces pale and empty, their eyes nothing but black voids. They didn't move, didn't breathe. They just watched. Lydia took a step back and then another, her body trembling. Her foot caught on something, and she stumbled, falling hard onto the gravel. When she looked up, the figures were closer. She scrambled to her feet, her pulse roaring in her ears. Without thinking, she ran toward the desert, away from the gas station, away from the figures, away from the unnatural darkness that seemed to follow her. The last thing she heard before the shadows swallowed her was the faint, crackling voice of the old man, echoing in her mind, "You should have left." The rain came down in torrents, each drop hammering against Amelia's windshield like nails. She had been driving for hours through winding back roads, her GPS rerouting endlessly as she tried to find her way to the small inn where she'd booked a room for the night. The forest pressed in from both sides of the road, its gnarled branches clawing at the night sky. Her gas gauge dipped closer to empty with every passing mile. She turned a sharp corner and spotted a figure standing on the shoulder, illuminated briefly by her headlights. It was a woman in a long dress, her back turned to the road. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her hair plastered to her head from the rain. Amelia's stomach churned. What was someone doing out here in this weather? She debated stopping. Something about the woman unsettled her, but leaving her there felt wrong. Against her better judgment, she slowed the car and rolled the window down just a crack. "Are you okay?" she called out. The woman didn't respond. She didn't move at all. Amelia frowned, her pulse quickening. "Do you need a ride?" she asked, louder this time. The woman's head jerked slightly, tilting just enough for Amelia to see her profile. Her face was pale, too pale, and her lips moved silently as if she were whispering to someone. Or something. "Forget it," Amelia muttered, rolling up the window and pressing the gas. The woman didn't react as the car sped past her, but Amelia couldn't shake the feeling of eyes boring into the back of her head. She glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman was standing in the middle of the road now, directly behind her car. Amelia's heart leapt into her throat. She sped up, her tires kicking up water as the forest blurred past her. She couldn't explain it, but her chest tightened with a sense of dread. She flipped on the radio, hoping to drown out her thoughts, but all she got was static. The noise grated on her nerves, so she switched it off. A loud thump shook the roof of her car. She slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. The rain continued to pour, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. Her breathing was ragged as she sat frozen, listening. Another thump, then a slow, deliberate scraping sound like nails dragging across metal. "Nope, nope, nope, nope," she whispered, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. Her instincts screamed at her to drive, but she couldn't move. Her curiosity got the better of her. Against her better judgment, she cracked the door open and stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked her instantly, plastering her hair to her face. She shined her phone's flashlight onto the roof of the car. Nothing. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she turned to get back in, she saw it. The woman was standing just a few feet away, her dress dripping, her hair hanging in matted clumps over her face. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her head tilted slowly, unnaturally, like a puppet on strings. Amelia's legs locked in place. What do you want?" she stammered. The woman's lips parted into a wide, grotesque grin, her teeth too sharp, too white. Her voice was a whisper, carried on the wind, barely audible over the rain. "Run!" Amelia didn't need to be told twice. She bolted to her car, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her hands fumbled with the gear shift as she tried to reverse, her tires spinning on the wet road. The woman didn't chase her. She simply stood there, her grin widening until it looked like her face would split apart. Amelia didn't look back again. She drove as fast as she could, the forest blurring past her. Her gaslight blinked on, but she didn't care. She had to get as far away as possible. Finally, she saw a gas station up ahead, its fluorescent lights a beacon in the storm. She pulled in and parked haphazardly, nearly tripping over herself as she ran inside. The clerk, a grizzled man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, looked up from his magazine. "You okay?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. There was a woman, Amelia panted, leaning against the counter. On the road. She wasn't normal. Something was wrong with her. The clerk's expression darkened. He set his magazine down and leaned forward. "Where exactly did you see her?" "About 10 miles back," Amelia said, her voice trembling. She was. "On Ridgewood Road?" the clerk interrupted, finishing her sentence. Amelia nodded. "Yeah." "How did you?" "You're not the first," he said, his voice low. "And you won't be the last. That stretch of road's been cursed for years. They call her the hitchhiker. Nobody knows what she is, but if she smiles at you, you're marked." Amelia's blood ran cold. "Marked?" The clerk nodded grimly. "She'll follow you. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but someday when you least expect it, she'll be there." The lights in the gas station flickered, and Amelia's reflection in the glass door seemed to waver. Behind her reflection, a woman smiled. The clock on the dashboard read 3:13 a.m. as Ryan drove down the empty stretch of highway. The road was a ribbon of darkness, the only illumination coming from his high beams slicing through the night. He hated late-night drives, but work had run long, and now he just wanted to get home, crawl into bed, and forget about the long day. The radio was on, playing faint static and distant murmurs. Something wrong with the station's signal, he guessed. He reached out to switch it off, but paused when he heard something faint through the static. A voice. "Don't stop." His hand froze on the dial. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, and it faded as quickly as it came. He shook his head, blaming his exhaustion, and switched the radio off. Silence filled the car, save for the hum of the tires against the asphalt. The night stretched on, and the road seemed endless, winding through dense woods. The trees were massive and ancient, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of some colossal beast. Ryan tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping into his chest. He was just tired, that's all. Then he saw it, a figure on the side of the road. Ryan's stomach flipped. He slowed down, his headlights falling on a man standing in the ditch. The man wore a tattered jacket, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat. He didn't move, didn't even flinch as Ryan's car approached. Ryan debated stopping. The man didn't look like he was in distress. He was just standing there, too still, as if he were a statue. Ryan's foot hovered over the brake for a moment, but something about the man made his skin crawl. He drove on. In his rearview mirror, the man turned his head, his face still obscured, and stepped onto the road. Ryan's heart raced. He pushed the gas pedal harder, trying to put distance between himself and the figure. He told himself it was nothing. Just a random hitchhiker. Or maybe some weird loner. People did strange things sometimes, but 5 minutes later, he saw the man again. This time, the figure stood directly in the center of the road, his back turned to Ryan's car. Ryan slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop just feet from the man. His headlights cast the figure in stark relief, illuminating the ragged clothes, the too-thin frame, the unnatural stillness. Ryan's hands trembled on the wheel. What the hell? The man didn't move. He just stood there, as though waiting. Slowly, Ryan reached for his horn, hesitating before pressing it. The blare shattered the silence, echoing through the trees. The man turned. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The figure's face, or what was left of it, was pale and distorted, the features warped and twisted like melted wax. One eye was too large, the other just a dark socket, and his mouth stretched unnaturally wide into a grin that revealed rows of jagged, blackened teeth. The man raised a hand, pointing directly at Ryan. Panic took over. Ryan slammed the car into reverse, the tires spinning as he tried to back away. The man began to move, not walking but gliding toward the car, his grin never wavering. Ryan didn't wait to see what would happen. He threw the car into drive and swerved around the figure, speeding down the highway at a reckless pace. The trees blurred past, the road ahead a tunnel of blackness. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty. Relief flooded his chest, but it was short-lived. A loud thud echoed from the roof of his car, followed by another and another, like footsteps. Ryan's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, his heart hammering in his chest. The footsteps moved, slow and deliberate, toward the windshield. Then the man's face appeared, upside down, grinning through the glass. Ryan screamed, jerking the wheel. The car skidded off the road, crashing into a ditch. His head hit the steering wheel, and for a moment the world spun in darkness. When he opened his eyes, the car was silent. The headlights still shone, illuminating the forest in eerie beams. Pain throbbed in his temple, but he forced himself to look around. The man was gone. Ryan exhaled shakily, his hands trembling as he fumbled with his seatbelt. He had to get out of there, find help, call someone. As he reached for his phone, a soft tapping sound came from the passenger window. He turned, his breath hitching. The man was there, crouched low, his face pressed against the glass, that same grin stretching impossibly wide. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as the man began slamming his fists against the window. Cracks spider-webbed across the glass, and Ryan scrambled to unlock the door on the driver's side. He stumbled out into the night, rain starting to fall as he ran blindly into the forest. The tapping followed him. No matter how far he ran, he could hear it, closer now, louder, as if it were inside his head. Ryan didn't stop running until the forest swallowed him whole. And when searchers found his car days later, they found only one thing inside, a note scrawled in blood-red letters on the cracked windshield. "I told you not to stop." The winding mountain road was treacherous in the fog, the kind that clung to the earth like a living thing. Sarah squinted at the narrow, unmarked turns, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She regretted taking this shortcut, but the detour had added hours to her trip, and the highway had been closed due to an accident. Her GPS was useless. "Signal lost," glared at her from the screen. She glanced at her phone. No bars. The isolation made her uneasy, the silence broken only by the hum of her engine and the occasional snap of a branch in the woods. Then she saw the hitchhiker. A man stood on the shoulder of the road, his silhouette barely visible through the dense fog. He wore a dark coat, his hood up, and carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Sarah's stomach churned. Something about him felt wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Her car slowed almost involuntarily as she passed him, her headlights sweeping over his face. His eyes met hers. They were wide and unblinking, and there was a faint, unsettling smile on his lips. Sarah didn't stop. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching her car disappear into the fog. Her chest tightened as she drove on. She felt ridiculous for being scared, but the image of the man's face stuck in her mind. She tried to shake it off, chalking it up to paranoia. The road twisted again, climbing higher into the mountains. The fog thickened, swallowing her headlights. She leaned forward, her heart pounding when she saw it. The hitchhiker. He was ahead of her again. He stood in the exact same position, his hood up, the duffel bag hanging over his shoulder. Her blood ran cold. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of her. The road had been a continuous incline, no shortcuts, no side streets. It was impossible. Sarah's foot pressed harder on the accelerator. This time, she didn't slow down. As her car passed him, she refused to look. She kept her eyes glued to the road ahead, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. But in her peripheral vision, she saw him turn. Her heart raced. She glanced in the rearview mirror. He was standing in the middle of the road, his face tilted toward her, that faint smile still etched on his lips. She tore her gaze away, her pulse roaring in her ears. Her hands shook on the wheel. She told herself it was all in her head, a trick of the fog, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. She just needed to focus on getting out of the mountains. The road wound on, each turn feeling identical to the last. Time seemed to stretch, and the fog grew heavier. She turned the radio on to drown out her thoughts, but all she got was static. She twisted the dial, but no stations came through. And then the sound came. A soft, rhythmic thump. It was faint at first, like something tapping against the back of her car. She ignored it, chalking it up to debris or the wind, but it grew louder, more deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. Her breath hitched. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again. She pressed the gas, her speed climbing. The thumping stopped. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. A new sound replaced it. A voice, low and raspy, whispering her name. "Sarah?" She slammed on the brakes. Her car skidded to a stop, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The voice had come from inside the car. She twisted around, her eyes scanning the empty back seat. Nothing. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the door handle, desperate to get out. But when she turned back to the windshield, he was there. The hitchhiker stood in front of her car, his face illuminated by the headlights. His hood had fallen back, revealing a pale, expressionless face, his eyes as black as the void. She screamed, slamming the car into reverse, but the moment she moved, he was gone. Her tires screeched as she sped down the mountain, the fog tearing at her like claws. She didn't look back, didn't stop, not even when her gaslight blinked on. Finally, the fog began to clear, and she saw the faint glow of streetlights ahead. A gas station. She pulled in, shaking, her entire body trembling as she stumbled out of the car. Inside, the clerk barely looked up as she approached the counter, her voice frantic. "There was a man on the road. He was following me. He kept appearing, and I don't know how he..." The clerk's eyes snapped up, his face pale. "You saw him?" Her stomach dropped. "What? Who?" "The hitchhiker," the clerk said, his voice barely a whisper. "People say he haunts these roads. You pick him up, you die. You don't pick him up." He trailed off, glancing toward the foggy road outside. Just Sarah followed his gaze. The duffel bag was there, sitting on the hood of her car. She didn't see the hitchhiker again, but she never made it home either. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, bathed in the dim light of a waning moon. Marcus drove his old sedan through the barren landscape, the radio softly playing a classic rock station to keep him awake. He had taken this route to save time, a lonely two-lane highway that cut through miles of nothingness. His fuel gauge hovered just above empty, but the next gas station was only a few miles ahead, according to the last sign he'd passed. He tapped the steering wheel nervously, hoping he'd make it. The isolation was starting to weigh on him, the kind of silence that wasn't just quiet but oppressive, as though the desert itself were alive and watching. Then he saw the lights. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a flicker of movement in the darkness. But as he squinted into the rearview mirror, he realized there were headlights in the distance, growing brighter. Relief flooded him. Another car meant he wasn't completely alone. The lights approached fast, too fast, until they were nearly blinding. Marcus eased to the side of the road, expecting the vehicle to pass, but it didn't. Instead, it slowed, falling into step behind him. The headlights loomed large in his mirror, close enough that he couldn't see the car itself, just the blazing beams. He waved a hand out the window, signaling for the driver to go around, but they didn't. The car stayed close, tailing him like a predator stalking prey. "Great," Marcus muttered, anxiety twisting in his gut. Some weirdo playing games. He pressed the gas, speeding up, but the car matched his pace. The headlights flickered once, twice, and then the horn blared, a long, low note that sent chills up his spine. Marcus gritted his teeth. "Fine. You want to play?" he growled, flooring the accelerator. The engine roared and his sedan surged forward, but no matter how fast he went, the car behind him stayed close, its headlights unwavering. Panic set in as he approached a sharp curve. The road signs warned to slow down, but he couldn't risk it, not with the car so close. He took the turn too fast, his tires screeching on the asphalt, the back of his car skidding dangerously. The headlights disappeared. Marcus glanced in the mirror, his heart pounding. The road behind him was empty. The desert once again cloaked in darkness. Relief washed over him, but it was fleeting. The absence of the other car felt wrong. And then the horn blared again. It came from in front of him. Marcus slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. His headlights illuminated the road ahead, and there it was. The same car, its lights blinding, its engine rumbling ominously. But this time he could see the outline of the driver, a shadowy figure sitting unnaturally still, its hands resting on the wheel. "How the hell?" Marcus whispered, his breath fogging the air. He blinked, and in that split second, the car was gone. The road ahead was empty once more. He sat there for a moment, his chest heaving, trying to process what he'd just seen. Then he shook his head and started driving again, slower this time, his eyes darting between the road and his mirrors. He couldn't stop now. The gas station had to be close. The sign appeared a few minutes later, its neon lights buzzing faintly in the distance. He pulled in, the relief nearly overwhelming as he parked next to the lone pump. The place was run down, the windows grimy, and the lights inside flickered erratically. But it didn't matter. He just needed gas. As he stepped out of the car, the cold night air bit at his skin. He grabbed the pump and started to refuel, glancing nervously at the empty highway. A voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't be out here this late." Marcus spun around. An attendant stood in the doorway of the station, his face partially obscured by shadow. He wore a faded uniform and a name tag that looked too worn to read. "Yeah, I know," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Had no choice. Long drive." The attendant didn't respond. He just stared at Marcus, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" Marcus asked, his unease growing. The man stepped forward just enough for Marcus to see his eyes. They were milky white, unfocused, like those of a blind man. "You saw it, didn't you?" the attendant said, his voice low. "Saw what?" "The car." The attendant's lips curled into a grim smile. "It follows people who don't belong here." "What the hell are you talking about?" Marcus snapped, his nerves fraying. The attendant didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked back into the station, the door creaking shut behind him. Marcus finished fueling up as quickly as he could, his hands shaking. He climbed back into his car, locking the doors out of instinct, and started the engine. As he pulled onto the highway, he glanced in the rearview mirror again. The headlights were back. This time, they were impossibly bright, filling the entire mirror. The horn blared louder than ever, and the car surged forward, slamming into his bumper. Marcus screamed, gripping the wheel as the impact sent his car skidding. The last thing he saw was the other car pulling alongside him. The driver turned to face him. There was no face, only darkness. And then everything went black. The next morning, the gas station attendant found Marcus's car abandoned on the side of the road. The engine was still running, the driver's seat empty. All that remained was a faint smell of burning rubber and a set of tire tracks that disappeared into the desert.